idea behind the first project class is that we are not looking to create any specific model. Rather, we are just getting used to the tools that allow us to create 3D objects. So let's continue on with this video on how we can delete geometry from our models rather than adding them. So, for example, let's say we select a singular face. If you remember from a previous video, we are able to delete objects by pressing the X key. But what does the X key do by itself in edit mode? Well, if I press the X key, it brings up the delete menu. Here we have a wide variety of options for the types of geometry that we can delete. For now, let's go with the faces option. I can left click and the top face will be deleted. This allows me to view inside of my model. Let's select this next face here, just below. Press X and delete face. Now we can see all the way through our object. Sometimes you may delete geometry that you did not want to get rid of. Again, you can use the undo function, which is to hold down Ctrl and press C. The type of geometry that you delete is going to have a significant influence over what is left behind. Deleting faces is simple enough, but what happens if we delete vertices? We're going to select this face here, press X, and this time I'm going to delete the vertices. What do you think is going to happen to the model? Keep in mind that when we grab, rotate, and scale the selection, it influences all the geometry that surrounds it. So does this apply to deleting geometry? The answer is yes. If we delete the vertices, we not only delete the top face, but all of the faces that were connected to it. The reason why is because when we delete a vertex, we are deleting all of the faces that that vertex is applied to. A face is dependent on the vertices used to create it, and so if one of those faces is taken out, then the face can no longer exist. And this is why in this scenario, we ended up deleting 5 faces instead of 1. In the past few videos, we've taken a look at the ability to add geometry using extrusions and insets, as well as the ability to delete geometry to customize our shapes further. But now we're going to introduce the concept of modifiers. So for this example, I'm just going to delete the custom object and replace it with a cube. Now we're going to go back into edit mode for our new object. We're going to go into face select and select the top face. For this top face, I'm going to delete it by pressing the X key and delete the face. Now we have an open top box. However, a box like this cannot exist in the real world. Its edges and faces are infinitely thin, and that simply doesn't apply to real world physics. You can't have a box that's this thin, so we need to add some thickness to it, and we can do so by adding a special modifier which affects the entirety of the object. To add this modifier, I'm going to go back into object mode for my cube. Then I'm going to go to the modifiers tab in the properties panel. You can see the modifiers tab here. It looks like a blue wrench, so left click and you will get the option to add a modifier. Left click to open the menu, and you should see a wide range of options here. Our choice is going to be this one, the solidify modifier. Left click and it automatically applies these settings to our model, and we can manipulate them here, so it's almost a sense of being able to procedurally edit our model in real time. The only option here that I'm worried about right now is the thickness. This is how much thickness that our box is actually going to be given from this modifier. So I'm going to click and drag, and as I do that, you can see from the various corners that we are increasing the thickness of our edges. You can apply a modifier by just going to the little down arrow here, left clicking and selecting apply. Before I do that, I want to note what happens if we go back into edit mode. When we go back into edit mode, you may think that we would be able to select all of the faces on top that we have generated, but we can't, because they still don't exist on the actual geometry. They're being generated by the modifier. So what's actually happening here is I'm just selecting the faces on the outside, because they do form the original part of the mesh. If you wanted to select the top faces on this box, or the faces that are on the inside of the box, you would need to apply the solidify modifier. To do that, we're going to go back into objects mode. We're going to open up this menu here and select the apply option. Initially, it doesn't look like anything happens other than the modifier disappearing. But if we go into edit mode, we will now be able to select the top faces as well as the faces on the inside of our box. So we've created more geometry using the solidify modifier. Now let's take a look at one more modifier just to finish off. We're going to go back into objects mode, and by the way, I've just done that by pressing the tab key on your keyboard. The tab key should be located next to the letter Q. So press tab to swap between edit mode and objects mode. Go to the add modifier menu again, and this time we're going to select bevel. Left click, and what the bevel modifier is going to do is it's going to create curved edges all the way around our object. So I can manipulate things like the amount, which is the distance of the bevel. And at the moment, I think the bevel is a bit too strong, so I'm going to reduce the amount to 0.02. We've now got a smaller bevel, both inside and out, but we can actually see the extra geometry a little bit too clearly. I want this to be a nice smooth edge. So what I can do is increase the number of segments. The more segments we have, the more geometry we add, and the more the bevel is going to curve around the edges of the object. So I'm going to set this to 5. And now we've got a very nice looking box that has thickness and also has nice smooth edges going all the way around it. And we've been able to achieve that by A, deleting geometry, B, adding a solidify modifier, and C, adding a bevel modifier. 3 steps to creating a simple but nice looking 3D model. We are now going to use the 3D object that we have generated to apply various materials to. Materials are used to dictate how our object responds when it is hit by sources of light. At the moment, we're actually viewing our 3D viewports in what is known as solid view, but there are different viewport methods. We can see these various methods up here in the top corner of the 3D viewport. Currently, we're on solid viewport shading, but this can range from wireframe shading, which allows us to view our edges and vertices, but we cannot view our faces unless we go into edit mode. We also have solid view, which we've been working in so far in this class. Material preview allows us to view the materials themselves using a basic lighting setup. And then we have rendered view, which allows us to preview our object with both materials and the lighting that we have generated for our scene. For now, let's actually go into our material preview, because we want to add a colour to our box object. And before we go any further, let's actually rename it as a box. I'm going to rename this as a plastic box. And the only reason why is because I have plastic boxes at home that have nice curved edges all the way around. So it reminds me of one of my own plastic boxes. Now I'm going to add my first material to this object. Go to this icon here in the properties panel. It's right towards the bottom and it looks like a red sphere. Left click and you will find the materials section of your properties panel. Click on the new button and this will add a material to your object. Now this has the name material.001. When you open up a project in Blender, your original cube is actually already going to have a material created for it, which is named as material. You can use any materials within your project that are available to you by going to this option here, which is a menu, left click and then choose the material that you want to use. For now we've created material.001 and I'm going to left click and rename this material. I want to give my box a bluish colour, so I'm going to name it as blue and press enter. But at the moment the colour isn't blue, it's white. If I want to change the base colour, I can scroll down to this option here. So we've got this white bar and we can left click on that bar to bring up our colour wheel. Now it's simply a matter of choosing which of these colours I want to use for my box. So I'm going to go with a very lightish blue. Something like that is pretty good. And it actually allows us to view the change in real time in our material preview. Note that if you go back to solid view, you will not see the materials. It just appears in its default shading. So if you want to view your materials, make sure you at least go to material preview. The materials will also be visible in your rendered view as well. So back to the material preview, we've created a material for our box. But let's say we wanted to create a different material for the bottom of our box. Well, to do that, we first of all need to create what is known as a data block to store the second material in. All of our materials are stored in these data blocks and this allows us to use them across various 3D objects. It also allows us to use multiple materials per single object. I'm going to click on the plus button right here to add a new material slot. There's no material assigned to this slot just yet, so I'm going to click on the new button right here. Actually, let's veer away from that and let's use the original material that's created at the start of every project. I'm going to make this a red material, so I'm going to rename it as red and press enter. Next, let's change the base colour. Left click, select the colour you want to use, and there we go. But there's a problem. The second material has not been applied to our object. So how do we get it so that we can use the red material for the bottom of the box? The key lies in edit mode and the ability to select your geometry. Go into edit mode by pressing the tab key. From here, we're going to select the bottom face. Select the red material in your properties panel and you'll notice that we have the ability to assign, select and deselect our geometry based on our selected materials. As soon as I click assign, the red material is going to be added to my bottom face. Now if I go back into my original view, we can see that the bottom face has a red material. And also, because we're using the bevel modifier, a part of the bevel has also been given the red material as well. But that's okay for this scenario. Now let's say I wanted to create a material for the top faces that surround my box. We can just repeat the process. So we can add a new material slot. This time we've got to add new because we can't use either of the materials that we already have. So we'll add new And this time I'm going to name it as a green material. Go to base colour and let's create a green colour for our material. Go back into edit mode and then we're going to select these 4 faces here. Now another method of selection that we've not demonstrated yet is the ability to select a loop. When you have a object that has faces of 4 sides, each face is connected by a single edge. And if we have 4-sided faces like we do here, we can create loops by using this edge flow. If I hold down the Alt key on my keyboard and then left click where we have one of these edges, we can select the entire loop. So now I've got my entire loop of faces selected. I can then choose my green material and select Assign. Now we've assigned the green material to the top of our box. So we've now got a blue box with a red bottom and a green top. For this video, I've decided to revert back to a new project with a basic default cube, as we are going to now take a look at a slightly more advanced way of creating materials using the shading workspace. Up to this point, we've been using the layout workspace for all of our work, but I want to create a slightly more complicated material that has a texture for my object. I'm going to do this by selecting the shading tab here in the header bar of my Blender UI. So this will take us to the shading workspace where we can add materials. Now we previously added materials here in the properties panel, but we can also add and customize these materials much further using this node system. This is where we have different nodes which are basically, in layman's terms, boxes of information that are connected using these noodles and sockets. Information is passed from one node to the next, and all of these node systems will end here in an output node such as the material output. For example, with this material which has been custom generated, when we open up a new project in Blender, we can manipulate the base color here. So we can left click and we can give it a new color in real time, say yellow. I can also edit many of these other properties relating to my material. Now there are a lot to go through here, so we're just going to demonstrate a couple of them. The roughness can be reduced to make our object's surface more shiny, and as I orbit my view you can see just how reflective it is with our background. So what you're seeing in the background here, the 3D viewport, this is called a HDRI image. It's an environmental image used to provide lighting around our scene. If I increase my roughness value, you'll see gradually that the reflection begins to get rougher and rougher until it almost appears as though there's no reflection at all. Another value that you can manipulate is this metallic value here. This determines whether or not your material is going to be a dielectric material or a metal material. A dielectric material is basically any material that is not a metal. So we can ramp this up to 1, and that will convert the material to be a metal. And in this case, it actually looks like we've now got a gold cube. We're not going to go any further with regards to any of these values. Instead, we're going to move on to the main part of this lecture, which is how to add a texture to your model. Now, before you add a texture, it's advisable to create a UV map. For our example though, we're using a pre-built cube, which means a UV map already exists for this object. If we go to the UV editing workspace, we can see here that we have the 3D viewport, but we also have this panel here, and this is our, if we have a look, UV editor. This is where we map out the geometry of a 3D object onto a 2D plane. To do this, you can go to your 3D viewport, go into edit mode and select all of your geometry. Then press the U key on your keyboard to activate the UV mapping menu. You can choose from a wide variety of options here, the most basic of which is the unwrap method, and you can control how your object is mapped by using seams. So I'm going to very quickly demonstrate what this looks like, but we're still going to end up using the default UV map. I'm going to go into Edge Select, and then I'm going to select the 4 edges on top of my cube. I'm then going to press the U button and come down to where it says Mark Seam. I'm going to left click, and now these 4 edges are highlighted red to indicate that seams have been created. I'm going to select my entire model, press U, and this time I'm going to press Unwrap. As soon as I do that, you'll notice that we have a different mapping system for our cube because we've marked the seams. Now this isn't anywhere near as good as our original one, so it would be a matter of just going through the various edges and trying to mark seams where appropriate. So I'm going to mark one here, and I'm also going to mark seams on the bottom of my cube. Then I'm going to hit U, select Mark Seam, hit A to select everything, hit U, and then Unwrap. Now I've got a much cleaner UV map. Of course, this is the basic of basics for creating maps, and as you create more complex objects, you're going to need a bit more practice when it comes to where to mark your seams and gain an understanding of how the seams cut up your objects. But for now, we're going to go and we're going to reset everything. And we're going to do that actually by holding down Control and C, because if we reset from our UV mapping menu, which we can do so here, it just makes all of our faces the same size. So for this, I'm just going to hit Control Z numerous times until we return to our original model with our original UV map. Next, I'm going to add in a texture that I want to use for my texture map, and I can do so here in my UV editing layout. I'm going to click on this open button, and if I just click and drag, we'll get a better view of it. And this will take me to my file browser. Now I've downloaded a material ahead of time, which is a marble material. There are many different locations where you can find different materials and textures for your models. I've gotten this texture from a website called textures.com. You will need to create an account with textures.com, but it is a free account that allows you to perform a certain number of downloads each day. I'm going to left click and then select Open Image. This is going to bring the image into our UV map, but it's not going to apply the texture to our model just yet. To do that, we have to link the texture to the material that is being used for our object. So go into the shading workspace again, and this time we're going to add a node that's going to be connected to the base color of our main shader. To add a node, go to the Add menu or use the hotkey Shift and A. Locate the texture category, and here you'll see a list of all of the different texture nodes. The only one we're concerned with right now is image texture. Left click and position it about here. Right now the image texture node is empty and not connected. To connect the image texture node, just come to where it says color and you'll see this little yellow circle. Click and drag to create a new connection, otherwise known as a noodle. connect it to the base colour of this principled BSDF node. The cube will now appear black. This is because we don't have any image textures connected to the node itself. Because we've already loaded in our target texture for this project, we don't need to go to the Open button to go to the file browser. Instead, we can click on this option here and we will have access to our texture. Left click and the texture will be applied to our model. We can use other nodes to determine how the texture is going to be applied. For example, we can use a texture coordinate node. So if we go to the input category of the add menu, locate texture coordinate and left click. We'll bring this one in and we have many different sockets that we can connect to our texture. So we have what are known as inputs, which for the texture is the vector, and we also have outputs such as the color. Our texture coordinate node only has these outputs. So for example, we can click and drag from the UV output and connect it to the vector. Or we can use some of the other outputs. For example, we can use the generated coordinate system instead of our UV map. In this scenario, it doesn't appear to be working that well. This is one of the reasons why having UV maps is so valuable. We can try objects, which actually has a similar effect. So in this case, let's just stick with the UV map. If we want to be able to move our texture around our model, we can add another node known as a mapping node. Again, go back to the add menu and then locate the adding node from the appropriate category, which is the vector category. Locate mapping and position it in between the texture coordinate and image texture node. Highlight it over the connection and left click. This will allow us to manipulate things like the rotation, location and scale of the texture, which allows us to change its appearance on our model. So this is basically an introduction into how we can create UV maps and then apply textures onto our objects by using specific nodes such as the image texture node, texture coordinate system and the mapping node. The last thing I'll do here is turn down the metallic value because I'm using a marble texture and marble is not metal. So now we've got a nice shiny marble texture applied to our object. In this video, we're going to be demonstrating how we can set up a very basic scene by creating objects and positioning them in front of our viewport camera so that we can prep for rendering. I'm going to start by opening a new project. I'm going to click Don't Save because I don't need this one. And the scene I want to create is going to be a customized object that's going to act as a stand to position Suzanne on top of. It's also going to need a floor with some walls. So it's like a room where the focus is going to be on a specific object. To start things off, I'm going to delete the default cube with the X key and then select delete. I'm then going to start by adding my floor. So if I hold down Shift and press A, I can locate the mesh objects and I'm going to choose plane. Left click and I've got my plane object. Now right now it's very small. I can scale my plane using the S key. So we're going to scale it out. And another thing that we can do with scaling that we haven't covered yet is we can use numerical values while scaling with the hotkey. For example, I can type in the number 6 while this hotkey is active and it will scale by a value of 6 on each axis. I'm actually going to go a bit higher than that. I'm going to go to a value of 10 and press enter. We now have our plane object that's going to act as the ground or the room. So I'm going to straight away rename this object by coming over to the outliner panel, double left clicking, and we're going to name this as room and press enter. Now you might ask the question why I have decided to create a room from a plane object instead of a cube. And the reason why is because I'm only going to want to create walls on the sides where my camera can see. To do that, we're going to go into edit mode. Now, since we're setting up a scene using all of the tools that we've learned so far here, I want you to see if you can do this ahead of time. I want you to create two walls, one here and one here. The tools that we have used to do so, we've already covered. So just give that a quick go and I'll see you in a sec. Okay, what we need to do is we need to ensure that we are in the correct method of selection, which in this case is going to be edge select. Then we're going to left click to select one of our edges, hold down shift and left click to select the second, and then we're going to extrude. We can do this either from the tool shelf or using E as our hotkey. So I'm going to press E and extrude. I'm going to lock it to the Z axis by pressing the Z key. And that's going to just bring our wall up to about here and left click. So now we've created two walls that we can view through our camera. So we can select our camera here and we can view our scene. Now at the moment the positioning of the camera isn't quite where it should be, but we're going to come back to that a little bit later on. For now we're going to go back into objects mode and create our second object, which is going to be the model that Suzanne is going to be sitting on. I'm going to go to the add menu and I'm going to introduce a cylinder object. Left click to add your cylinder. Next, we're going to scale the cylinder. So we're going to hold down the S key. And then we're going to scale it down on the Z axis to about here. Then left click. Let's zoom in to get a better view. And we can see at the moment that a part of our cylinder is currently going through our ground plane. I'm just going to hit the G key and just bring it up on the Z axis until it's roughly sitting on top. Next, I want to scale this so that it's a lot bigger. I'm going to hit S and then I'm going to want to scale on the Z plane because I don't want to scale it up on the Z axis when I've just scaled down. Hold down shift and press C and we'll scale up. We'll scale to about here and then left click to confirm. Now I want to perform some editing for my cylinder, which I'm going to rename as my stand. Let's press enter to confirm the new name. And now let's press the tab key to go into edit mode. This time I'm going to go into face select, select my top face, and I'm going to scale it down. Then I'm going to hit the I key to create an inset. And I'm going to inset to about here. I'm going to hit the E key to extrude up to about here and left click. Then hit the S key again to scale in. So I've combined several tools here. I've combined scaling with insetting with extruding to create a custom shape that's going to act as the stand of my object. Let's hit the tab key to come out of edit mode, and the next step is going to be to add in our main model, which is going to be our monkey object. Hold down shift and press A to return to the add menu and then select monkey. Right now it's currently piercing through several other models, so we're going to hit the G key and bring it up on the Z axis. Now if we bring it up, we can see that it's currently resting on the object's chin. Now this doesn't look very natural. I'm going to want it to be rotated so that the face is pointing upwards and that it's resting on the back as well as the front. To do this, I'm going to use the rotate tool. So hit the R key, and then we're going to have to lock it to an axis. Now the axis here is going to be X, and this will allow us to rotate correctly. I can play it by eye, or I can use a numerical value. If we take a look near the header bar of the 3D viewport, you can see how much we're rotating by on the X axis. I'm going to use a numerical value here, so I'm going to use minus 35 degrees because I already know ahead of time that that's the correct rotation to allow Suzanne to sit on top of a flat surface. There's currently a little bit of space, so all we're going to do is hit G, then Y, and bring it down. Now we're almost done. We've got a few things left to do, and I'm going to demonstrate two things that we haven't seen so far. The first is an effect called smooth shading. So at the moment, if we take a look at our stand, you can see all of the individual faces. But I don't want to see all of my faces. I want to have that appear nice and smooth, and I can do that by using the right mouse button, and this will open what is known as the Object Context menu. The first three options here are Shade Smooth, Shade Auto Smooth, and Shade Flat. Currently, we're using flat shading. For this demonstration, I'm going to use Shade Auto Smooth, as it's the option that works best for this type of object. You can now see that the lighting on the model has changed, and we can no longer see the individual faces. The second thing I'm going to demonstrate that we haven't seen so far is the ability to add geometry using a special modifier known as Subdivision Surface. So we've already covered modifiers in this class, and we're going to introduce our third one right now. Go to the Modifiers Properties tab, add modifier, and this time select Subdivision Surface. Left click, and what that will do is it will add geometry around your entire model. It's also going to create curvature where there were sharp edges. We're going to open up this area of the UI so we can get a better look at the Subdivision Surface modifier, and we can see we've got a couple of options here. For the viewport levels, the higher the value, the more geometry is added and the better it looks. So we're going to increase this up to 2, which is the same as for our render. We can still see many of the faces, but rather than increasing the viewport levels too high, we're going to repeat what we did for the stand. Right click and then Shade Auto Smooth, or this time we can just use Shade Smooth and it should give us the same result. So now we have two objects that are nice and smooth and ready for rendering, apart from one thing: materials. So now we're going to add materials to the plane, the stand, and the main model. And I'm going to just rename our main model as Bob. So starting with our room, we're going to go to the Materials tab, we're going to add New, and let's just name this as the Room material. Let's give it a dark blue colour. So we can create the colour here, and we can make it darker using this bar next to the colour wheel. We can't see anything in this method of shading, so we're going to go to our material preview. So we've got our blue material for the room. Next we'll select the stand, select New, and this one is going to be the stand material. Press enter, and now we're going to create a material for the stand. I'm going to want this to be a dark grey, and I'm also going to want it to be metallic. Let's reduce the roughness a bit so it's a little bit shiny. Finally, we've got Bob. Now for Bob, I'm going to apply multiple materials to my main object. This is also going to involve demonstrating another method of selection, and that is the ability to select islands. What I want you to do is I want you to first of all add a new material, and we'll just call this Bob. We're going to give it a base colour, and I think we'll go with a nice orange. And next I want to add a material for the eyes. With the Bob object selected, we're going to hit the Tab key and then left click away from the model so that nothing is selected. With the monkey mesh, we actually have 3 islands. We've got the head and then each of the 2 eyes. They're actually separated in terms of their geometry, but you can't see that because the eyes are inside of our model. If I press the L key on my keyboard hovering over the eye, I can select it. I can also select the other eye with the L key and add it to my selection. So now that both my eyes have been selected, I can add a new material, select New. I'm going to name this material as Bob's Eyes, press Enter, change the base colour to be a nice bright blue and click Assign. And now I've assigned 2 materials to Bob the monkey. Hit Tab and we've got pretty much everything in place. There are only 2 things left to do before we can render. The first of which we will do right now, which is to position our camera. If we were to go into our camera's view, we can get a good look of the scene, but at the moment I feel as though we can bring the camera up a little bit. The easiest way to do this is to open up the side panel by pressing the N key. Then we're going to go to the View tab. We have several tabs here within the side panel, and the third of these is the View tab. Left click and there'll be an option under View Lock that's labelled Lock Camera to View. We're going to left click this option, and now when we navigate around our scene, we will be moving our camera as well. So for this, I'm going to hold down Shift, use the middle mouse button and just bring it up slightly. Let's orbit the view to about here and just try and get the right view for our render. Let's zoom in a bit more and I think that will do. So once we're happy with our camera, we can turn off the camera to view option and then orbit to move out of our camera's view. Everything's set up except for the lighting, which we will do so in the next video, where not only will we be creating a new lighting system, but we will be using an add-on to achieve it. In this step, we're going to be demonstrating how we can set up a 3-point lighting system by using an add-on. Before we create our 3-point lighting setup in our scene, we're going to take our original light object and we're going to delete it, because we're not going to need this anymore. Next, we're going to introduce add-ons for the first time. Go to the Edit menu here in the header bar of the Blender UI and left click. At the bottom of this menu, you will be able to access the user preferences. Open this up in a separate window. We have a wide variety of options that we can manipulate from the preferences panel, but the one we're interested in is this one, add-ons. Add-ons allow us to introduce new functionality into Blender. Many add-ons already exist within Blender but are not yet enabled, such as the ones that you see here. We want a 3-point lighting setup. Now, I believe this is known as tri-lighting in Blender, so I'm going to go to the search bar here and type in tri. The third option here is for tri-lighting. So I'm just going to open this up and we get some useful information, including the location within Blender where we're going to be able to find this functionality. Left click to enable this add-on and then close. Now we're going to select our main object, which is Bob. We're going to want the lights to be focused on Bob, so we need to select him first and then bring up the add menu. This time, instead of adding a mesh object, we're going to add a light object. We can add different light types, but the final option is going to be for the 3-point lighting setup. This will not be visible if you do not enable the add-on. Left click and 3 lights are going to be added to your scene. They are going to be named here in the outliner panel. So we've got a key light, a fill light and a background light. Let's now take a look at our scene through our camera. So click on the camera button and then we're going to transition to our rendered viewport shading. It doesn't appear as though our lights are working, but that's simply because the power of each light is a little bit too low. What we can do is we can select our lights, for example the key light, and then increase the power. It's set to 3 watts, which is far too low. I'm going to set this up to 400 as a starting point. That looks pretty good. Next, let's add a fill light and increase the power to 250. Finally, I'll take the background light and increase this to 175. That's a pretty good lighting setup for our render. So now we've created a scene where we are able to light around our main model using a 3-point lighting setup. At this stage, everything that we have wanted to do has been done. We've created our models, set up our scene, applied materials, and even set up the lighting. That just leaves us with one final stage, and that is to render our image. We are now set up for the final stage of our project, and this is going to be the rendering stage. We've already determined where our camera is positioned, allowing us to create a render of our image. When we do render the image, everything that you see within this border is going to be a part of that image. To render an image, just go to Render and select Render Image, or use the hotkey F12. I'm going to use Render Image now, and instantly I'll get a rendered image of my scene based on my camera's view. I can then go to the image menu, select Save As, and then find a location to save my rendered image. So I'm going to go to my Windows file, and I'm just going to create a new folder, label it as renders, and now we can give our render a name. So we'll just render this as render 1. Press enter and select save as image. So now we have successfully saved this image to our computer. But that's not the end of the video. In Blender, we have access to what are known as rendering engines. In this class, we've only been using the Eevee render engine, which allows for much faster results using rasterization as the main method of lighting our scene. An alternative render engine to use in Blender is CyclesX, which focuses on path tracing to map out the scene. To change your rendering engine, go to the Render Properties tab located in the Properties panel. It's the one that sort of looks like the back of a camera. The very first option here will be your choice of render engine. Currently, we're set to Eevee. we actually have a lot of additional options that we can change here. So before we change our render engine, let's see if any of these make a difference. For example, we've got screen space reflections. Now, as soon as we activate that, you'll notice that there's a reflection of Suzanne, or Bob as we've named it, in certain areas of the stand, because the stand is quite reflective. If we turn that off, you can see they're no longer visible. So we can turn on screen space reflections, open this up and potentially manipulate some of the other options to alter how our screen space reflections work in our render. And then we can go render, render image, and now we've got another render, but with screen space reflections applied. So it looks just that little bit better than our initial result. Now let's take a look at the Cycles render engine. Just left click where it says Eevee and select Cycles. The middle one is the Workbench render engine, and this one isn't actually used that much for rendering, it's used more for previewing your scenes. So we're going to go to Cycles, and you'll notice that the viewport gets a bit fuzzy initially. And that's because Cycles uses a far more powerful, far more realistic method of mapping the scene. Therefore, if you don't give it much time to make those calculations, the result is going to appear fuzzy and all in all not that great. If we take a look at the settings that we have, we'll notice that we have the ability to define which device is used for the rendering process. By default, this is set to our CPU. In most cases, you're going to want to use the GPU. So we can select it, but if you find that this option is grayed out, it may mean that you don't have your GPU active with Blender. To correct this, go to Edit and Preferences. Then go to the System section and ensure that your Cycles render devices is set to the appropriate option. By default, it would probably be set to none, and when I do this, you can see that the device option is grayed out. Because of the graphics card I am using, I'm going to go with Optix for the best results. If you've got an older NVIDIA card, you may need to go with CUDA. And if you have an AMD card, you may need to go with HIP or One API if you're using an Intel GPU. I'm going to go with Optix and close. Below that we have the additional options for sampling, which includes the ability to sample for our 3D viewport and for our renders. We have the noise threshold, which determines how noisy we're going to allow our image to be. The lower this value, the longer our render is going to take, but the cleaner the results. This is used in conjunction with the maximum number of samples that are allowed per frame rendered. So these two work together to ensure that we get the result that we want. The defaults are actually pretty good for this, so we're going to leave them as they are. The other option that I want to highlight is this one here, the denoise option. This allows us to enable a denoise pass once the render has been completed. This will be useful if you have run into time constraints and don't want to expend that many samples or that lower noise threshold for your render. In the case of noisy images, denoising does exactly what it says on the tin. It will clear up any noise within those renders, but it may come at the cost of finer details. We're going to keep it on, but in this scenario it would probably be okay to have it switched off as well, because it's not the most intensive scene in the world. With everything set up, we're going to render one more time, but this time with Cycles active. So go Render and Render Image. You will notice that the Cycles engine will take considerably longer to complete than the Eevee render engine, which was an instantaneous result. But by comparison, we are getting a result that is based more on the properties of real world lighting. So here I'm just going to go image, save as, and this time I'll just save as render to and select save as image. Now I've completed 2 renders of my scene, one with Eevee and one with Cycles.